Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, everyone, for being here today, and really looking forward to the discussion today. Rather than do you the disservice of trying to introduce such an illustrious group myself, I thought I'd just go along and ask each person to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do and their interest in this area.
Mike Nohaley. I'm at Amgen, and for the purposes of this, I lead our digital health and machine learning and AI efforts across the company.
I'm Narain. I'm founder and CEO of BERG. We're located right here in Framingham. We put together a platform that merges systems biology and artificial intelligence to drive a new wave of biology-based drugs.
Hi, my name is Tom Lynch. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Bristol-Myers Squibb. If you told me a year ago that I wouldn't have been in the first panel that just spoke, okay, I would have said I would have felt much more comfortable there than in this panel. I was at the MGH for about 25 years, and I was also the director of the Yale Cancer Center. And now the promise of AI is incredibly important to me in my role at Bristol-Myers Squibb.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hopkins. I'm a founder and CEO of Exscientia. We're the first company to really show we can actually design novel molecules for clinic use in AI. And prior to that, I was a professor at University of Dundee and 10 years at Pfizer before that.
Hi, Kathiresan. I'm a cardiologist and a geneticist by training. I lead a human genetics research laboratory that spans Mass General Hospital and the Broad Institute, and we study the genetics of heart attack with the goal of informing new medicines development as well as improving preventive cardiac care.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, all. So, I'd like to begin by first talking about genomics. And during the past roughly decade or so, we've seen an explosion of next-generation sequencing data. And this comes from patients with both rare Mendelian disorders, complex trait diseases like coronary disease or myocardial infarction, and then most importantly, from patients with cancer. So, first I'd like to ask the question of, has this actually had an impact on our ability to identify high-quality drug targets? So let me start with Mike.
Yeah, so we acquired Decode Genetics, which those in the field will know, end of 2012. And that has really transformed our drug target efforts. We've reshaped our entire portfolio around it. And there's almost nothing left in our portfolio that's not informed. Obviously, we've launched Repatha. That did not come out of Decode. That's a PCSK9. Not everything is as clear. That is a pure genetic target story where the genetics alone pretty much guarantees you that it was going to do what it said it was going to do. Most of the rest of the targets, it's something less than that definitive, but it does give you a lot more confidence, or sometimes rule out things that you just don't see any genetic support for and you decide to move away from.
Fair enough. So, Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'd say two things about AI and drug targets. One, it's in helping identify targets, and I think we're in the early parts of doing this. And I think back to an article on the front page of the Times that basically said genomics fails to deliver on the promise of the Human Genome Project. And that article was just written about 6 months too early, okay, before we really began to understand how incredibly important genomics was in understanding science. I think AI is really at that same place in terms of being able to uncover relationships in big databases. I think the second place that AI in drug development will be important, not only will be important in telling you what target to go after if you're a drug developer, but it'll also be important in helping you elucidate biomarkers that choose patient populations. And I see Greg Myers sitting in the front, and I know that half his world is worrying about contracting with Blue Cross Blue Shield and Tufts and all the different payers in all these markets. And the payers will increasingly demand that we are able to select our patients better so that we're able to deliver a value equation. So I think that AI will begin to also reveal better biomarker targets for our drugs.
Then, Sek, let me hear your thoughts from the more basic research perspective.
Yeah, I think the key concept that has been helpful in terms of at least genomics and new medicines development is a protective mutation. So the mutations that people carry, let's say, that breaks a copy of a gene, and instead of increasing risk for disease, these mutations actually decrease risk. So they protect people or provide resistance to disease. And these mutations are incredibly helpful because if you can develop a medicine that mimics that mutation, it's much more likely to work in the clinic. And for a range of diseases now, there are these protective mutations that have been identified, and there are medicines development oriented toward that. And for cardiovascular disease, there's 7 examples right now, including PCSK9, and there are medicines being developed against each of these targets.
You know, and just to follow up that question, Sek, you know, you've been a part of the human genetics of coronary artery disease from the beginnings of the GWAS era. When we first started to do GWASs, was it obvious that this would be the big win for drug development, or was it something that we kind of realized more slowly and over time?
Well, I think the protective mutations, typically they tend to be quite rare in the population, so it's not till very recently, actually, that we've had a window into these. And so I think in the last few years, with the application of low-cost sequencing to lots of samples, and you could do the genotype-phenotype correlation, these rare mutations, particularly in coding sequence, have been the most helpful. So it's only been the last couple of years.
Just to build on that slightly, I think initially people thought the common mutations, the common variants would tell us stuff, and as said, what's really turned out to be the winners are these very rare protective variants. If you can find a few people with them, you can say something. Maybe the common variants will come through at some point, but that has not yet.
Actually, one point to that is that, you know, it's not always the case. It's rare, actually. So, for example, PCSK9, the key, the mutation that gave the insight is pretty common. It's present in 1 in 50 blacks in the United States. So I think the frequency of where you're going to get the insight can vary, but in general, it is the rarer mutations.
So let me switch gears for a second. So, you know, have there been actually any non-trivial examples of using machine learning to either identify new drug targets, to create new drugs, or to better predict the patients that will respond to a given drug? So, Andrew, let me start with you on that one.
So even, this goes back to my work in Pfizer when we first started to build knowledge-based systems to derive a lot of value for the company. And we saw the real first applications was in drug repurposing. Before we started to apply it to design of sort of novel entities. And you can actually then start by using a whole range of machine learning, ontologies, natural language processing, sort of bring then a wealth of data integration together to then map on top additional information on top of genetic information. And this then led us to start to identify some hypotheses, which then allowed us to, by combining literature data, what we were getting from our own internal trials, so on Lipitor and Miravroc, allowed us then to start to identify really unusual sort of hypotheses for which then, when mining the data, we could find answers. You know, interesting ones we started to come across then was why things like Miravroc started to rise HDL unexpectedly. Of course, that was just after Tirzepatide just failed, so the company wasn't particularly interested in those kind of HDL approaches at that time. But it, for me, then started to point out that this combination of using machine learning approaches actually to mine it actually really could start then to bring a links that could aid with serendipity. You know, that could. Most of these discoveries, as you know, are led by clinicians in the clinic making observations. But it really is the power now of a wealth of data to have start to come up with clinically testable hypotheses in a very rapid and systematic manner with these technologies.
So that's a very good answer, but you know, let me push on a little bit more. Have we actually seen a drug go into clinic where non-trivial machine learning was actually the difference between success and failure?
In terms of our own work, in terms of molecular design, absolutely yes. So we have our first molecules now designed by algorithm, which one of our partner companies is planned for phase 1 next year. So that to us is a real game changer in terms of an achievement. In terms of drug repurposing, then if you look at Benevolent in London, claiming and doing now with ALS, then they now have the first sort of molecules they've repurposed from Janssen, you know, headed for that indication, which directly came from their platform.
Okay. So Niven, I'd love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so at BERG, what we've actually employed over the years, the use of patient-driven biology. So we actually start our discovery process by taking clinically annotated human tissue samples and doing a full omics profile on those tissue samples. And what we do is we employ the use of Bayesian artificial intelligence to merge the disparate data sets from the genome, the metabolome, the lipidome, and then correlating that with clinical and demographic data. And what we're trying to get at is actually the causal elements in the biology that is different within hundreds or thousands of patients. And that becomes a starting point of our drug discovery process. So we've actually had a few examples where we've had the repurposing example of our lead cancer asset by employing this methodology to figure out that the drug would work on highly metabolic tumors. So so it helped to stratify out our entry points into GBM and pancreatic, high-grade GI oncology tumors. And we also have a pipeline of de novo candidates that have come out of this process in second-generation oncology and CNS diseases.
So, let me just kind of pull on this thread a little bit more. I think it's fair to say there's some promising leads, but we're not yet at the point where it's really ready for prime time. So, Tom, let me ask you, why haven't we had more successes so far?
So
yeah,
I
please.
think that's a good point. I think what I would say from my perspective, and again, in fact, I know nothing about AI. But what I would say is that I think there's a difference between AI and big data, okay?
Right.
I think big data has definitely informed and enabled uncovering of targets. Has AI actually done that? Okay, I would, you guys know this field better than I do.
Right.
Has AI been the thing that's done that the way it has in some other areas? On the other hand, what is AI other than enabling us to be able to use big data in a way that can be done within our lifetime in a fast way? So I think that, again, we're still early in this process of that transition between understanding how to link disparate databases to be able to make the kind of clinical correlations that you need to be able to do and have that done by machines.
So just to push on that, yeah, go ahead, Sek.
Yeah, Anthony, so I couldn't come up with a clear example for cardiovascular disease, so I sent out your question on Twitter, and I got back a GIF with
Nice.
crickets chirping, and so I think that's the answer, at least for cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
Yeah, well, and so let me ask the question is, why has drug development lagged other fields, like, let's say, from the tech industry? It's certainly not because the financial rewards for innovation aren't there. Is it because we don't have the right data? Is it because we don't have the right people? Is it because there's just something different about the nature of the problem?
So in terms of the area we work in, molecular design and drug discovery, what we found was the biggest hurdle was actually cultural adoption. So technically, we've been working in this field now for 12 years, first building with data layers, 10 years in building algorithmic layers, and 5 years now commercially validating, et cetera. And what we found actually is that when we first started doing this, actually people just think you're smoking something. The whole idea that something as creative as drug design, which humans have to integrate with data, come up with a hypothesis, and then turn that into a molecule, is an inherently creative human activity. How can algorithm even begin to sort of mimic that? But it turns out algorithms absolutely can, and in fact are far better than human drug designers in doing so, in the data we've delivered and the candidates we've achieved so far. So what we're seeing then is that this is an incredibly early day. We're almost sort of starting to write day off before we've even begun to do it. There's only been a few companies, like BERG as well, who've already been doing this for a while now, and they actually have been the pioneers in driving this field forward. They've companies like ourselves as well. We have been, toiling in this area, developing it when it was incredibly, not very fashionable. And so now the world is incredibly turned. Now people are starting to see some emerging results, which are showing promise. And it really has got incredible promise. Because the good thing about the algorithms is that the systems keep learning. They keep getting better. They don't retire with a golden watch and all that institutional knowledge walks out the door. So this is why I think, be careful not to write someone off far too soon, because we've only just started on this journey.
Yeah, I would only say that I push back slightly on the framing, because the image that comes, and it's the one that worries me, is somewhere someone pushes a button and it all happens. And I think we are seeing advances, right? But it's more the Centaur model, where you have the human helped because you're using deep learning visual stuff to scan plates so the human doesn't have to do it. Or you're using natural language processing so that it gives non-trivial keyword insights from the literature and suggests things to the human scientist to do. And we're already seeing the beginnings of that. But the press button, where you just press a button and all the data sets come together and everything just happens, I think that will happen. I just think that that's the next generation. It's complicated. The data sets are incommensurate in some cases. They're not available. In some cases, when we've tried to apply machine learning, the structure of the data is hard to work with. I mean, the underlying evolutionary logic of how the genome goes together can be quite baffling. And again, maybe we just haven't figured out how to apply it properly yet. So I think you have to think it in more incremental steps to get to where you're going.
Yeah, I think there's also two things here from a pragmatic and common sense perspective. I gave a talk a few weeks ago in MIT, and I was struck. There was a Harvard doc who got up and said, look, what you said, it makes sense. You know, precision medicine, you know, giving the right drug to the right patient at the right time. So when am I going to do that? I have to see 25 patients, and I have to teach. I have committee meetings. I don't even understand how you even implement this stuff, AI and technology and precision medicine. So the way that the practitioner has to operate on a daily basis, and this is a pretty senior academic doc at Harvard. How about your primary care physician in a community? And then secondly, I think the alphabet of AI. AI is probably the most prostituted term in healthcare over the past year and a half. What is it? What is really AI? I had a Stanford AI guy say to me, you know, technically Excel is AI. You put your numbers in, the machine kicks it back out. And by definition, the machine that makes the decision without human use is AI. So that alphabet, whether it's neural networking or Bayesian networking, analytics, we need to get the alphabet right. And we need to do it as a community, because otherwise we'll confuse the hell out of each other. And I've been doing this for 10 years in AI. So we, even on the panel, we all are using these different terms. We probably can, you know. So I think that's a really key element.
So just to add one other thing, I think that when you look at our field, and whether it's Pfizer or Amgen or BMS or Novartis or Merck, I think one of the things that people can point to is the relative lack of productivity of the movement of molecules from discovery all the way through development. There have been obviously great examples of things that have been breakthroughs, but it takes way too long and it costs way too much. So when I think about AI enabling pipeline development, I think of some of its mundane transactional stuff that actually can make the clinical trials process move faster. Things that can allow us to identify targets that are already identified, but to take molecules from discovery and move them quicker into development. Those are places where I think we'll see our first application. I think Mike's point about it not being pushing a button and having a drug come out of the computer is much more likely that some of the transactional advances that enable us to increase speed and productivity, which is really what a lot of people are asking for now.
I think. Let me go on to the next question. We'll come back. This is, I think, a recurring theme. But you talked about kind of moving drugs to the clinic and increasing the probability of success. I'd like to ask a kind of unusual question. As someone who's not very involved in drug development, it looks a little bit like prospecting for oil. And what I mean is that you have a very large upfront capital expenditure, followed by a binary event where, if successful, is often very lucrative. And in the world of oil prospecting, we have companies like Schlumberger. And what they do is they don't actually drill for oil themselves. They make sensors and develop analytics and kind of have human services that increase the probability of success measurably, and they've done very well. Why don't we have the equivalent of Schlumberger for drug discovery? Why don't we see platform companies with advanced technologies that are forming valuable partnerships with people like you guys to impact the drug development process? Tom, let me start with you, and then I'll actually want to go to Andrew, and then we'll go around. Yeah.
Well, I think we are going to see those, actually. I think Exscientia is going to become one of those companies. And so what we're starting to see, and I want to pick up on what point Tom was making just now, is if AI is going to make a difference, it's actually going to make a very simple difference. The simple difference is going to be in earnings per share, and it's going to be actually in how do you make our productivity gains by making better decisions. We have a very simple mission in our company, which is how do you move from an idea to an IND by making the best decisions possible with AI to make the fewest number of molecules, because each molecule we make is a cost in terms of synthesis and biological testing. So if better decisions to make few molecules, the faster programs can run within 1 year rather than 4 years, and it allows you then to really show a very simple equation about where the difference that AI is going to make. And it's all about bringing information to bear to make a much better decision making. And the big challenge, actually, what we talked earlier, why haven't we necessarily seen the impacts of our previous technologies, is because we often take a technology and we add it to an incumbent existing process. So we add in, we don't actually allow a technology to fully develop and mature. So in many ways, a current process we have is in many ways the fossilization of old technologies that allow us to do things in a certain way. The challenge that AI really gives us is allows us to properly exploit it, actually to redesign our processes, just like your professor was asking, how am I going to fit this into my day? And that's a really big challenge, actually. And we've been able to do it as a small company because we got white space. You know, we got no incumbent processes, so we can design from the start. But it is actually going to be one of the big challenges. It isn't just AI. The whole Centaur system is based on the concept of having AI plus expert plus the right processes of how they integrate it. And that is going to be one of the biggest challenges for current companies and truly getting the benefits this technology is going to bring, but actually then try to bring it in-house.
And I think it's already happening. I mean, if you look at the Roche acquisition of Flatiron, I think that's a great example that by a big, large development company that they need the data expertise that's present in a big data company. And AI becomes the language and the way that relationship will actually work. So I think you're starting to see it in a number of different companies and places where platform companies are having a greater influence.
And even just to go to the exact analogy, there are definitely companies out there that are starting to put more sensors on the experimental equipment, link it together. And of course, one of the great challenges in academic and industry research in biology is it's very hard to compare experiments because often the conditions aren't exactly the same, the starting materials aren't exactly the same, everything's not exactly the same. So, and again, now it's a different revolution, it's the sensor revolution, which you gestured at, but of course to interpret it you need, whether we call it AI or just advanced analytic tools in order to make sense of it all. And again, I think that's the kind of thing that will advance us faster as we don't go in circles, as we have to repeat experiments until we realize half of it was wrong because we get it right the first time. You go faster, you go cheaper, you get to market faster. So there are definitely companies out there that are pushing this. I just don't think they get a lot of headlines.
All right, so let me ask you another question. Going back to precision medicine, we talked about that a little bit earlier. For many years, we've had the goal of trying to take common diseases and carve them up into mini sub-diseases. In some examples, we've been very successful. Lung cancer, not least because of your efforts, Tom. In other cases, it's proved a little bit more complex, coronary artery disease. And so, I'd like to ask the question about how should we be thinking about this overall framing of precision medicine going forward? Is it really the case that we're going to take common diseases and carve them up into many different sub-diseases with many different treatments, or is it going to be something different? Sek, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think there are two models I think people have in terms of common complex diseases like heart attack or diabetes. And one model is that in any given person, there's a single driver that is leading to the disease. And so, for example, you'll often hear something like diabetes is really 20 different diseases, only if we knew the single driver in each person. The other model is there actually are a set of finite number of causal mechanisms, but in any given person, it's actually a quantitative blend of the mechanisms. Maybe one mechanism a little bit more prominent in one person versus another, but in each person, it's not a single driver, but actually a quantitative blend. I think if you think about those two competing models for common disease, it's pretty clear that basically the single driver in each person is not what's operative. That actually in any given person, heart attack is because of the blend of many causal pathways. So I think precision medicine is more about identifying those causal drivers with the idea that you'll be able to treat them. And, and treatment of those drivers should have an effect, maybe different degrees in different people, but it should have a therapeutic benefit. I think the first model of in any given person a single driver doesn't really seem to hold.
Yeah, I think it's happening in cancer for sure. If you look at lung cancer, when I trained in lung cancer, we looked at small cell and non-small cell. Then it evolved to be histology. Now you've got ALK, ROS, EGFR, PD-L1 positive, TMB high, RET translocations, and you can go on and on. There's 7 or 8 more. And so I think you're seeing increasing development of drugs in smaller and smaller spaces. And that, I think, is going to be a trend that's going to continue. I think the reason it's going to continue is what I said earlier about value. And I think that the payer will increasingly drive the importance of defining patient populations that benefit. The idea that you could develop a drug that's only going to work modestly in 20% of the patients, which is what we did with chemotherapy back in the 90s, it would be insane today. You've got to have much greater effect size on a larger group of patients to be able to make a difference. And I think that subdividing patients into molecularly defined classes in cancer, in heart disease, in immunoscience, I think you're going to start seeing that more and more and more.
I would only say, and I used to run the molecular diagnostics unit at Novartis, I guess I'm always being deflationary on this. The naive idea that you're going to find a biomarker and it's going to tell you exactly what to do, as was said, is just not turned out to be true, right? There aren't these magic biomarkers that stratify the patients beautifully in many cases. Occasionally there are, and in cancer there definitely are. But I think we thought in lots of diseases we were going to be able to find these biomarkers and do it. The number of biomarkers that have actually advanced that have huge discriminatory power outside of cancer is still relatively low. They're getting better. I think they will get there. Maybe more data and some of the techniques we're talking about will get us there. But again, it's not so simple that it's always the right answer to find the magic biomarker that solves all your problems.
Well, but I would argue one of the reasons is because outside of cancer, you haven't seen the same commitment to collection of biosamples, to molecularly profiling patients. It doesn't routinely happen in rheumatoid arthritis.
But what's interesting in cancer, that's why it's interesting that the BMS person who owns Devo on the stage is going down the molecular route. I mean, you guys are showing that the PD-1, in some cases, irrespective of PD-L1 levels, will have broad efficacy. So it's not that the biomarker doesn't help you, but it doesn't tell you every single thing that you would want to know.
No.
So it's a naive sort of interpretation that I'm arguing. It's not that it doesn't help you actually do the biology. It's complicated and it's nuanced and it requires some real work to figure it out.
Yeah, I think in germline, so cancer, entirely different somatic mutation, single driver leading to disease. In germline disease, basically every other disease, it's just not the case that basically there's a single driver in the majority of people. It's really the additive effect of many things, and that's just what we've seen.
So, but does that mean that it's even possible to have different treatments for different people with coronary artery disease, or is it really just going to be statins and then more statins and more statins still?
Well, no, there are basically like at least 5 different pathways that have been identified that are causal. So LDL, one, but LP(a), triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, there's a handful of things like that. And the question is, how do you enrich for the individuals that are where there's that driver is happening? It's a blend, but in some people, LDL may play a larger role, and some triglycerides may play a larger role. But it's all relative. It's not this is it for this person.
All right. So going back to kind of the questions about machine learning and AI in drug discovery. I think one of the things that many people have pointed out is the differences, cultural differences rather, between the world of technology and the world of drug development in medicine. So I have a kind of few questions for you guys on this topic. So first, when we think about trying to converge the worlds of data sciences and the world of life sciences, who's going to figure it out first? Will drug development companies and pharmaceuticals figure out how to build great data science teams? Will tech companies learn how to make drugs? Or will we see the rise of a third class of company that is built differently from the beginning? So let me start with Niven.
That's a great question. I live that every day. I got to tell you, when we first started out, and I put together, mathematicians and physicians and chemists and physicists, and we put them all together to try to fuse these disciplines, because our belief is that you can't just bring the complexities of biology, and certainly in heterogeneous populations like cancers, down to one thing. I agree with Mike. It's not just one biomarker that's going to just drive these causal elements. And I've come to the realization, both from a drug development perspective, but also even if you look at how investors and analysts and your traditionalists do things, it's not going to come from one or the other. It is really going to, it's going to need a fusion. And the intersect of biology and mathematics, I think, is going to be where the step change is going to happen in medicine, because we're seeing it with our own data sets, through our partnerships and our trials. I think that obviously the specialist, there's no way a data scientist is going to know the touch, to feel the elements of a physician. That's not going to happen. But on the other end of the picture, a physician is not going to understand that the hardcore algorithm. So bringing them together and having a translator in the form of a commercial person or someone to say, okay, how do we productize it? What's the end point? To look at, kind of like the perspective of what Mike does, the who cares effect. Is the physician going to care? Is the payer going to understand it? And is the patient going to understand that it could make a difference? Because it's not always this boutique treatment. I don't think precision medicine is always going to be about a boutique treatment for a patient. It could be, for all the clinicians in the room, it could be something as simple as how you schedule a drug. Sometimes just switching when you give a drug, how long you give a drug can make such a difference in an impact. So it's also those types of answers that can change outcome.
So I think it's going to be a new breed of hybrid companies that really understand the domain, because the domain is complex. You need to know which questions to ask, what's valuable to answer, as well as actually having that hybrid understanding of the maths as well as the chemistry and biology. And why I say the hybrid companies? Because we look at other revolutions. When the internet took off, it wasn't the traditional advertising companies, whether television channels or big advertising channels like WPP were the companies which overtook advertising search. It was completely new incumbents, such as Google, etc. So if it was positioning themselves as a new kind of advertising company, it wasn't the traditionals which then took up place. It was actually people who understood that hybrid. So that's why I think it's going to be understanding both domains, understanding what the problems are in this space, which are completely different from the kind of problems tech companies normally look at, but using the tools that the tech companies and academia have developed. And that's going to be the sweet spot between the two. And I think it allows potentially fast-moving companies to come in and actually try to actually take a land grab for that space going forward.
All right, so we've heard two startups say that it's going to be a new generation of companies. Let's hear from the drug developers.
I think the expertise of the companies you're hearing about is going to have to be reflected in the drug development process. And so, whether you call it 2 companies, 1 company, 3 companies, I think you'll see a bunch of different models emerge. I think in some cases you'll have big companies that will partner with smaller companies to get that expertise. I think in some cases, if you have a company that's well-versed in one of the other areas, they could morph into something that's more blended. But I think it really doesn't matter whether it's 1, 2, or 3 companies. I think it matters that the expertise is well reflected in the process of drug design. And I think there's probably a lot of different ways of getting there, and you'll probably see several types of companies emerge that get us there.
Yeah. The ecosystem is really important in this space.
Yeah, I think it's really going to have to be a collaboration between people with different areas of expertise. And what I see is that you have to ask the right question and then interpret the results correctly. And a good example is a recent story that got a lot of press from Google actually, using AI to predict risk of heart attack, using retinal images. And this is a very interesting story. So retinal images in a couple 100,000 people. The software engineers at Google applied AI, and then the headline was, looking at these images, you can basically predict somebody's risk of heart attack. But if you read the paper, what they were able to predict was actually somebody's age based on the vasculature, the retinal vasculature. And given that age is the #1 factor in predicting risk of heart attack, the older you are, more likely to have a heart attack, you basically can tell somebody's age within 3 years, plus minus 3 years, by looking at the retinal vessels. So this got a tremendous amount of attention in the public press. Now we've finally arrived in terms of AI. But then if you look a little closer under the hood, the results are less stunning. So I think it really have to be a collaboration to ask the right question and interpret it properly to get to a good solution. Yeah.
So this is probably the thing I spend the most time thinking about, not which company's going to win, but how do you get a company that can do it? And I'm going to steal a concept that Andrew Ng talks about a lot, which is the rise of electricity. And the fact that when electric motors came in, it took several decades for people to fully take advantage of them. Because the first thing they did was they replaced the giant steam motor in the middle of the factory. But it took them a while to figure out, well, I can redesign the entire factory. I can have electric motors all over the place doing all kinds of things. And so as much as the technology is impressive, people are going to have to completely rethink how they work. And whether that's going to be done at the existing companies are going to do that first, or new companies are going to come together, or we do it jointly. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm very convinced that's the work to do. It's neither exactly how we do it today, nor is it the naive view of someone who doesn't know drug discovery, how to walk into drug development and just start doing it a new way. It's some fusion of those two things. But I think it's going to take a while to fully get all the value out of it, because there's a lot of possibility out there.
Well, let me ask all of you the question. Is there any group that you've come across that you're really impressed by how far they've gone and how well they're doing it and straddling this divide? Pass.
I
All right.
got to say, Big Pharma are really opening up right now. Even in the past year, the change has been, quite seismic. There's a few which are, it's just window dressing. There's been the CEO has set up a working party and it's like, you just get a few things in. There's others who are actually thinking about how they embed it into the DNA of the organization. And so you are starting to see over the next few years a differentiation of how people then start to adopt it. In terms, as you said, all the different questions you could ask within an organization, and others then which might take a window dressing kind of approach. But it is starting to happen. And in fact, at this conference today, in fact, there's so much interest actually shows that something has actually turned. We've turned a corner and there's interest now. The key thing now is to how do we really deliver on it? The promise is absolutely there, but delivery is going to be about as much the business models, about the right applications, and about embedding it in the right processes. And that's a really sort of unsexy part of all of this, which is it's not just about tech. It's actually about how tech fits with processes, how it changes with processes. And that is where the real innovation is going to come. When we started making cars over 100 years ago, there was only like 2,000 different car companies in the US at the time. But it was only when someone decided to change the process of how cars were manufactured, when Ford introduced the assembly lines which you saw in the meatpacking industry, then that revolutionized the industry. And then that took over. And then, of course, you're left with a few incumbent companies that really adopted that new process. So it isn't just going to be the shiniest new tech that's around. It's going to be how that tech fits into the process to deliver what is absolutely required in terms of productivity, et cetera.
Yeah, I think actually you see in other industries the power of the consumer take hold. And I look at some of your patients, what they say in reports, et cetera. It's so powerful. For the patients where Opdivo works, it works so beautifully. And I think that the patients are going to be the real judgment factor. They're going to call us out, as they should. And by the way, we're also all patients, by the way, everyone in the room. So I think we live in an industry, if you look at just, aside from this topic, you look at the Sarepta story and the power of and the vision of the patients and the families and the advocacy, that's something that we don't talk about as much, and we should start talking about that. Because this conference was put on by a great partnership of two great hospitals. And the patients and families will, at the end of the day, drive the outcome, whether it's Bayesian or neural or AI analytics, whatever you want to call it. If we don't make a step change to the physicians, if we don't start creating drugs a lot faster and cheaper and getting them with less toxicity, we won't be up here in 2 years.
If I could just follow something that both Andrew and Mike alluded to, which is, I think Mike's analogy about the motor in the center of the factory is a great one. And then to Andrew, this idea that we won't even know all the different places AI will make a difference. One of the places I think you really do need to see innovation is in clinical trial design, okay? And this is something where in my old life at MGH and Yale, I know how inefficient and how incredible amount of money that both those institutions put into clinical trials to make them work. And now on the other side, it's even magnified even greater in terms of how difficult it is to do clinical trials, how inefficient they are, and how can we make them more reflective. So the idea that if you're going to develop a cardiovascular drug, and if Seek has access to not 10,000 person control group, but 1.5 million lives through the Partners Data Bank, Biobank, or through other big, large samples to be able to look at effect sizes of new treatments without having to do a randomized trial, those kinds of things might begin to make a big difference. And so I think that'll be another area to look at to really see the promise of this technology.
Well, say, go ahead.
Just building on that, I think one application that I see a lot of promise is in predicting event rates in trials. And so if you think about, the 488 trial for PCSK9, the median follow-up was 2 years, about 5% of individuals had an event. But 95% of people then didn't have an event. They had no opportunity to actually benefit from the medicine. So if you could actually figure out who the 5% are going to be over a 2 to 3 year period, have a recurrent heart attack, that would be very powerful. And I think that's like the perfect setup for AI, where you have a lot of data, and then you have a binary 0, 1, they had an event, didn't have an event, and to be able to predict that. So I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of, at least in the cardiovascular space.
Yeah, if we could have spent 5% of the money we spent on 4A, I'd be very happy.
But if I could, push the bar out a bit further, just think what real implications longer term could be for this. Because AI and allowing algorithms to actually take decision-making processes, and the human steps back. The human's there as a centaur to shepherd the system, but at the same time allowing the algorithms to truly make decisions, then it opens up then a whole new framework of actually how we think about drug discovery and development, even to approval. So where we're looking at in early stage now, we basically think about it as adaptive design. It's a learning cycle rather than an execution cycle, because biology is far too complex. We can't fully predict everything at all. What we have to do is learn our way into systems and learn as efficiently as possible. And that's how we then try to bring those productivity gains. We've got that now here today in the world of drug design. In terms then of designs of clinical trials, then of course we have got Bayesian statistics and adaptive trials are a way forward in that space. And of course then you can start to link the two together. And how do you then bring the idea of adaptive design then from the molecule back into a trial as a continuum? But of course we also now have the emergence of things like conditional licensing. As we gather more evidence, then approval potentially into greater patient populations, access to drugs earlier. And you can start to see how individually these are all separate activities at the moment. But under the right decision-making framework, which is driven by algorithmic approach, you can start to think about then how it becomes a continuum between the identification of molecular targets, the design of the right molecules, how then we start to expand with clinical trials adaptively in which they tested, and when they start to run promise, actually start to release that to the paying population. Whether or not we've got the actual regulatory framework to actually conduct such a thing is actually a topic for an entirely different conversation. But there might be countries, just like what China's doing with its new FDA at the moment, where there's been a tenfold increase in resources just this year, opens up a possibility that there may be other players who actually would take this and consider it as a new paradigm. And that's what I think it really points to, not just applying AI in individual segments where we're going to put the motors in the factory, so to say, but actually thinking about what the entire factory is going to look like. And do we need a factory in the first place, or can we have a different sort of network of doing things? I think that's, if you follow the logic and follow the philosophy of AI, you could get to a situation like that where it impacts approval just as much as it impacts drug design.
So let me ask another question here, especially given all of our conversation today. On the research side, if you had $100 to spend, how much would you spend on data generation? How much would you spend on data scientists to analyze the data? And how much would you spend on software that somebody else built to analyze the data and help your people be more productive? Niven, you want to start?
Yeah, I would definitely say anything you do in life, but especially when it comes to the science, it should be, I think we have some lessons around us that show when you don't put a quality design into anything and you don't start with the right tissues and samples and the etiology of what you're studying to embrace the complexity, I would definitely put the investment, as we do, the investment up front into the relationships, into the acquisition of those samples, the quality measures, the adhering to those. The data sciences component is extremely important, obviously, but I would weigh the medicine and the biology that's coming in to that's being exposed to the algorithms, and then of course the software. I'd probably do I'd say it's about 70-30.
Okay, 70 on the data generation and 30 on the software and people. All right, Mike, what about you?
The first thing that popped in my head was 80-10-10, so 80% on the data generation. But I think there's one piece that's missing too, so maybe it's 70-10-10-10. There's money that needs to go in, an effort more than money, into making sure that the non-data scientists, the actual scientists, not that they don't need to know a random forest from a Bayesian network, et cetera, but they need to know what they're looking for and what they're looking at. And it comes back to how you're going to change that culture and the way that they work and get them comfortable working with the data scientists, working with the third-party software. So I would just add a fourth category.
One of my mentors, David Altshuler, always used to say, the future belongs to computationally enabled biologists, which I think is a good way. So Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, it's funny because I thought that the guys in tech would say, 10% on data generation and put 90% of your money on software and analysts. But I actually agree with you. So I think I still would put heavily toward data generation, and I think that as time emerges, the value and return on investment increases on good software platforms and better data analytics.
Sek, what about you and your research? What's your breakdown?
I think that one, one development to kind of take into account is a lot of the data now is available out there in the public domain, particularly when you're looking for new molecular targets. And so if you're trying to figure out what's the best target for disease X, you may not have to actually spend a lot of money generating, at least from the genetics side. So that's something to keep in mind. It depends on the goal, I guess. So in my mind, if the goal is just target ID, then maybe most of the resources should be allocated toward analysis rather than generating new data.
Okay. Andrew, your final thoughts?
I was going to pick on you very point. Since everyone else has spent any money generating the data, I would take a lead and I look at the metrics of my own company, which is at least 50% on generating new algorithms to learn from that data. But a big chunk of it is probably spending 20% just on human relationships and interactions, understanding, working with the clients, working with the customers about how do you interpret and understand what's going on here. That's an incredibly important overhead. You still need to introduce people so they get comfortable with understanding why an algorithm has made a certain decision and actually then to trust it.
Excellent. Well, so we're very much kind of coming to the end of our time. Maybe I'll just ask everyone to go through and sort of give a few closing thoughts, and as we kind of conclude this session. Mike, maybe I'll just start off with you.
Again, I think this is, if you understand the mathematics of machine learning, a lot of it is S-curves. Starts out slow, exponentially explodes, and then tails off. And that's what this is. We're still at the bottom of this. I do believe there'll be an exponential explosion of this. I just think we have to be realistic of where we're at and the steps it'll take to get to that push-button solution.
Yeah, I think that, I think I alluded to it earlier, I think that the outcome of irrespective of what technology is, but especially because AI involves, bringing together the stakeholders between payers, providers, data scientists, biologists, et cetera. Following it all, the one thing that we didn't really have the time to touch on today, but showing the post in silico, post AI validation. So going back into the blood samples from patients to validate biomarkers, and going back in a wet lab and using CRISPR-based technologies to knock in or knock out certain elements as predicted by AI to show a change in function. When we bring that all together as a community and then show that difference in patient outcome, I think that's where it's going to take hold, because most physicians don't want to see it, they want to feel it. So I think these types of panels drive the conversation.
I would just say I think that what you've heard today is that we're still very early, which I would agree with. I think that the techniques and processes of AI will have a transformative impact on our industry. I think our industry needs it. I think the great news is when you combine what can happen with AI with the emerging data that's being generated at the Broad in genomics, in clinical trial data sets, in linking all of this to patient outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, it gives me real promise for the fact that we will come up with better drugs moving forward for a number of different diseases.
I think for me, the transformational power is absolutely huge. So whenever we've added new technologies previously, we didn't really see the difference in the timelines, et cetera, in discovery or the clinic. We just added the cost, et cetera. Because what we've been doing was adding to the cognitive burden, the cognitive overload of people having to make decisions. What this technology allows us to do is actually to change that by actually allowing the algorithms and the technology to make the decisions for us. And therefore, it can deal with a wealth of new data we now plug into the system. That, for me, why it was fundamentally transforming, because it's about access that allows us to ask a question, how do we change the entire process of how we do drug design and discovery?
Yeah, the analogy that I have is with for something from everyday life. One of the apps that I use every day is Waze, right? I think we all use it. Basically, you know, anytime I need to go anywhere, I put an address in, and 99% of the time, it gets me to the point that I want to get to within a minute of the ETA. Now, if the technology is good enough to do that, I don't see why it can't actually improve the way we discover new medicines and try to help patients. So I'm very optimistic.
Excellent. Thank you very much.